Why are environmental issues so tricky to tackle? This lecture is about the complexity of environmental problems. A week often doesn't go by without hearing about one of the many environmental issues we face on our planet. Many of these issues are complex, so it's not easy to place them in one simple category. We'll start this lecture by going through the five major categories, and as we walk through them, we'll talk about how they're all interconnected. The category of environmental problems that connects closely to our course is that of environmental depletion. This includes environmental issues where the planet's natural capital has been exhausted or diminished due to the overharvesting of these resources, or by damage caused during the harvesting of the resource, or through other human actions that have caused harm to the environment. Waste and pollution are two categories that are closely related, since many forms of pollution are technically a type of waste that humans have produced during their activities. Generally, waste is a byproduct produced during the making and the use of a wanted product. There are many different waste as subcategories waste, such as hazardous or non-hazardous waste, liquid and solid wastes, biodegradable and non-biodegradable waste, or recyclable and non-recyclable waste. Pollution is a harmful type of waste which contaminates the air, water, soil, or living organisms. It can be caused by a pollutant material, such as fertilizer that is run off into the aquatic ecosystem, which then causes an algae bloom. Or it could be a non-material pollutant, such as light pollution or noise pollution. Issues that fall under the category of environmental change are ones where something has been added to the environment, which is transformed or caused issues with the functioning and stability. Examples would be, for instance, invasive species or diseases that have entered into a new ecosystem, or too many greenhouse gases that are being added to the atmosphere, leading to different issues connected to climate change. The last category that connects with the health of humans and other species. These environmental health issues can be linked to pollutants contaminating our air, our water, or soil. And these could be things such as asthma, lower sperm count, as well as mutations. Or they're connected to environmental changes or environmental degradation, such as the introduction of new diseases due to rising temperatures because of climate change, or the lack of clean drinking water. Now that you're familiar with the major environmental issues, let's discuss some of the reasons why it is often hard to be able to tackle these environmental problems. One reason why environmental issues are so hard to tackle is because humans don't perceive time and space very well. For instance, we often don't perceive environmental changes because they often occur gradually. For example, the disappearance of the Aral Sea in the former Soviet Union, which is now part of Uzbekistan and Kazakhstan. This environmental issue occurred gradually, and it wasn't perceived as being a major problem until 20 years after the water first started to disappear. Another issue of human perception of time and space connects with our inability to understand and deal with major long-term issues. Instead, as humans, we tend to tackle only short-term or immediate issues, and we put off long-term issues. A Canadian example of this is the decades-long battle to have the city of Victoria stop dumping raw sewage into the ocean and to build an actual treatment plant. Starting in the 1960s, the municipality started using short-term solutions, such as screening the wastewater or extending the pipe further out into the ocean. Finally, after decades of putting things off, a new sewage treatment plant was finally built, and in December of 2020, it started operating. You have probably heard people, such as politicians, say that they don't want to make environmental changes due to the costs or the risk of losing jobs. For instance, you may hear this often during discussions about the carbon tax. This argument is connected to this space and time psychology perception issue. The last issue connected to this aspect of human space and time perception is a personal experience. You probably don't connect, for instance, with the issue of the Arctic warming because you don't live there or you've probably never visited the Arctic. Unless they directly affect you, such as having your home burnt down in a wildfire that was triggered by a climate change related drought, humans often don't perceive the environmental issues as their problem. The second um, the second way or reason why environmental issues are so tricky to tackle connects to the issue of resource availability. Humans, especially those that have never experienced shortages in their lives, often have their perception that resources will often exist as they always have. So sometimes we call this the frontier mentality, that there's always going to be fish in the lakes and more forest or land on the horizon, just like it's been during our parents' or our grandparents' time. So someone with a frontier mentality may think that what's wrong with clearing a forest? Because there's still lots of other forest there. Or what's wrong with accidentally overwatering my lawn or the sidewalk and the street when water's so cheap and always appears when the faucet's turned on? The flip side to the perception of abundance of resources is the environmental issue when humans perceive when that's a resource is actually rare. They may not see environmental consequences of their actions trying to acquire that scarce resource. So, for instance, is it worth the environmental impact to require a rare resource such as diamonds? This is actually a diamond mine that you can see here in the Northwest Territories in Canada, especially when these diamonds are basically just used for jewelry, so they're actually not important to our survival. Or is it worth digging a deeper well to get into an aquifer in order to get the water before our neighboring farms do, such as here in the Central Valley of California? The third group of reasons why environmental issues are tricky to tackle connects with the limits of scientific research into environmental problems. For instance, we can sometimes only theorize about environmental issues since we don't have the technology that can detect or measure the problem or be able to compute the results. For instance, there's no giant sonar fish finder that can detect how many fish are still left in our oceans. In the past, climate scientists could only theorize about climate change until computers are actually powerful enough to be able to run the complicated data models. Even today, there are vast amounts of data and scientific observations that have actually not been digitalized. And so we can't use these past observations in our current understanding of how the environment has changed. Another issue connected with with science is that we don't always foresee the problems until it actually happens. Microplastics, for instance, didn't really start being researched about until about 1 or 2 decades ago. Even though plastics and plastic waste have been around for a while, and environmental scientists have actually noticed that plastic waste has been a problem in the environment. An historical environmental problem that connects with these different issues is the one where we actually learned about the hole over the Antarctic region. When researchers started monitoring the ozone layer back in the late 1950s, they were doing it as part of a larger scientific endeavor connected together with the International Geophysical Year. Scientists around the world wanted to know more about our planet and ended up starting up major scientific investigations in different parts of the world. Researchers started seeing a reduction of the ozone layer readings in the Antarctic region during the 1970s. But they didn't have enough computer power to actually really put together all of this data. It wasn't until the early 1980s when computers were much more powerful that and there was improved satellite technology that they could actually understand that there was a hole in the ozone layer. So this is pictures of the hole in the ozone layer in the 1970s when it was first detected to here in the early 2000s. And you can actually see how the size of the ozone layer hole has actually increased. And once that information was actually publicized back in the early 80s about the issue, we worked towards fixing this issue by reducing CFCs. And you can see that slowly the size of this ozone hole is starting to close, like we see here in recent pictures. Ownership is the fourth problem connected to the major global environmental issues. If a resource is not owned by anyone, there's much less incentive to want to conserve and look after that resource. The world's oceans um, and the fish within it and the atmosphere are good examples of this. Other environmental and resource management issues stemming from ownership is when multiple groups claim ownership over a resource. This is connected to the human perception of scarce resources mentioned earlier, and we'll be talking more about this issue in the next unit. Who gets heard is the fifth barrier. Mother Nature has never had a voice. So, for instance, relatives of a killer whale that has been killed by a boat when a boat hit it cannot seek justice for an accidental homicide, and a river can't sue a company that's pouring toxins into it. The legal rights of nature, however, is actually something that's changing with environmental law. And there are now laws that exist in 17 different countries at different governmental levels that are connected to the environment having a voice. Areas and people that face the greatest environmental challenges are often ones that have no voice. For example, the island nations in the South Pacific and the Indian Oceans are greatly threatened by rising sea levels. Many of these different countries have collaborated together during international climate change negotiations, since together they have a much stronger voice. But even then, they're often ignored. Climate change refugees, which are people that have been displaced from their lands because of climate change impacts, don't have legal international status that refugees fleeing from political or religious persecution do. Those that express their concern about the environment often don't have major economic or political clout. This has been changing over the past few decades as more and more political and business leaders have been stepping up and voicing their concerns. However, those that voice their concerns about the environment in some countries often face dangers of being arrested or much worse. For instance, in 2019, a total of 212 land and environmental activists were murdered because of their actions in defending the environment. The last reason for why environmental issues are so tricky to tackle basically comes down to the main reason for why we actually have environmental issues in the first place. It's because of humans. If we are to fix environmental problems, we have to think of ourselves as part of the environment and have to change our own self-interest and make sure that our own self-interest don't come first. In general, it's hard for us to be able to wrap our heads around the idea that we are our own worst enemies when it comes to the environment and that we all play a role in its impact, no matter who we are, where we live, how old we are, or if we're rich or we're poor. In general, it's hard for us to be able to wrap our heads around the idea